What's up, guys? My name's Stu, and today we're going to be looking at my Broadside Surgical Strikes build on the Excelsior II. So I managed to pick up one of these ships not long ago, and obviously I was going to put a Surgical Strikes build on it because it is a full intel ship, but the question came down to, do I want to use a dual beam bank build on it or a Broadside Surgical Strikes build? So I asked you guys, and I did a poll, and about 3/4 of you said Broadside, so that's what we're doing. Here she is, the Excelsior II. Honestly, I don't think she's as pretty as the original Excelsior, but still a good looking ship. Like the other T6 versions of the original Excelsior, this too is also a heavy cruiser, but that's about where the similarities end stats-wise. The original Resolute had a command seat, the legendary version was a miracle worker ship, but this is an intel ship. And of course an intel ship means it's optimal for a Surgical Strikes build. And on top of that, this thing also has a secondary miracle worker seat, which means we're going to be adding even more to our energy weapon damage output. But before we get more into the bridge officer seating, let's take a look at the gear first. Also, fingers crossed that all my bridge officers don't unslot themselves when I open up my status menu. That's been happening a lot lately. Like I said in the intro, this is a Broadside Surgical Strikes build. That means all my firepower is going to be focused on the left or right firing arcs of my ship, rather than the forward arc. So that means my weapons are mostly comprised of beam arrays. Most of these are Agony Phasers, and that's because, one, I already have them upgraded to Epic, but also because Agony Phasers look very much like TNG era phasers, so I figured this could also be a sort of canon-esque build for the Excelsior II as well. Granted, we don't know that much about the Excelsior II because we didn't see it that much in Star Trek Picard, but we can make some reasonable assumptions given the time period that it's active in, so that you could make this sort of a TNG/post-TNG theme build, but built around Surgical Strikes. Now, the thing about Surgical Strikes is that it critical hits pretty much 100% of the time, so you want to get your crit severity up as high as possible. So really, honestly, what I probably should have done is, instead of going with Agony Phasers, I probably should have gone with Advanced Phasers or Sensor-Linked Phasers. The proc on Advanced Phasers gives a chance to increase the crit severity of all advanced beams on the build, and Sensor-Linked Phasers actually give a permanent buff to your weapon amplification skill, which, that's your crit severity skill. But like I said, I kind of wanted this to look a little more visually thematic for the era that it's supposed to be from. Along with the Agony Phasers, we've also got the Terran Task Force Beam, which that one's pretty obvious. This is one of the most powerful energy weapons in the game, so of course it's on here. The Wide-Angle Quantum Torpedo. I usually like using a wide-angle torpedo on my broadside builds because, well, it's a wide-angle torpedo. All my firepower is going to be focused to my side, so I better have a torpedo that's capable of doing that too. Sadly, there aren't a lot of wide-angle torpedoes in the game. There's only like 3 of them. This one, the Prolonged Engagement Photon Torpedo, and one I can't even remember the name of. I'm sure someone will say it in the comments below. And the last weapon on the build is the Trilithium Enhanced Omnidirectional Phaser Beam. Now, normally an Omni Beam on a broadside build is actually kind of pointless. Being a broadside build, you're already going to have a much wider coverage of fire than a normal forward-facing build, but also a normal beam array would actually do more damage than the Omni Beam. However, I'm using the Trilithium Omni because of its unique proc that has a chance to buff my weapons haste. One more thing I could have done with the weapons is that I probably could have incorporated at least the Discovery 2 piece into here. I didn't want to use the Dark Matter Torpedo because it's not a wide angle and this is a broadside build, but I could have used the Dual Beam Bank on the console. The Dual Beam Bank from the Discovery reputation is a wide angle dual heavy beam bank, which means it has a firing arc of 135 degrees, which is wide enough to get those targets on your sides. That coupled with the console, and I could have gotten that stacking crit severity buff. But like I said, I wanted this to be more visually thematic, and that Discovery Dual Beam Bank certainly doesn't look very post-TNG. Moving on, the core set is my usual setup for an energy weapon build. So that's the Colony Deflector, because that buffs both your crit chance and crit severity, also your shield penetration. The Impulse Engine from the competitive reputation for the speed buffs. Though if you're not a fan of the speed buff, alternatively you could go with the Romulan Advanced Prototype Impulse Engines from the Romulan reputation. Those Impulse Engines also have a buff to your weapon amplification skill, which again, that's crit severity. It's not a large buff to that skill, but it's still one you don't normally get from that type of gear. Next we got our usual Plasma Integrated Warp Core from the Fleet Spire, and the Discovery Reputation Shield for the extra damage it gives against enemy shields. In the devices, first we've got Energy Amplifiers for the bonus damage to my energy weapons, Deuterium Surplus for the speed buff, Reactive Armor Catalyst in case I need a quick heal, Kobayashi Maru Transponder for the random buffs that it gives, and in the 5th slot, in the past I've used Red Matter Capacitor here, but I've been using the Subspace Field Modulator more just because it doesn't share a cooldown with any of the other 4. Moving on to the consoles, in the Universal slot as well as all my tactical console slots, Vulnerability Exploiters. These are here to buff my phaser damage and my crit severity. Like I said earlier, Surgical Strike's critical hits pretty much 100% of the time, so there's no need to buff your crit chance. So we can dedicate all this console space to critical severity. A while back, I did a Surgical Strikes build on, I think it was the Bozeman Intel Frigate, where I used a bunch of vulnerability locators. Yeah, I don't know what I was thinking either. Yeah, this is what I should have done. Anyway, moving on to the next console, Experimental Power Redirection, which this is the console off of this ship, the Excelsior II. I actually really like this console, not only because it's given me some reasonably useful passives, but just because I really enjoy its click ability. Activating it will force my weapons to alternate between Beam Overload 3 and Fire at Will 3, and each second that it's active, the console will fire off an auxiliary phaser beam using Overload at Will 3, which is exactly what it sounds like. I really like this because it's a good way to clear out mobs of small ships. Surgical Strikes is really nice for the amount of damage it's able to put out, but it's still a single target build, so you're going to have to take out those enemies one at a time. However, if I find myself swarmed with small enemies, I just hit this console and bam, they're all dead or heavily damaged pretty quickly. And frankly, just from a gameplay perspective, this is how I like to play the game. My ship just firing beams like crazy in every freaking direction. Honestly, this console's kind of perfect for me. The rest of this is pretty obvious stuff for an energy weapon build, at least for me. We got the DPRM for its massive bonus damage buff, along with the Domino for its buffs to bonus damage and firing cycle haste. Timeline Stabilizer, this is here because this also gives firing cycle haste. In the past, I've typically run Temporal Trajectory Shifter. That actually gives quite a bit more firing cycle haste, but it can only be used against one target at a time. Once your target is dead, then the console resets. Whereas Timeline Stabilizer will be active during its full duration. Temporal Trajectory Shifter would be good for something like Infected or Kittimer, you know, where you're going up against multiple big heavy targets that are going to take a lot of damage to kill. Mainly the Transformers, the Gates, and the Tactical Cubes. But Timeline Stabilizer would be better for something where you're going up against a lot of the smaller enemies, like Swarm or Defensive Starbase 1. Actually, another good alternative would actually be the M6 computer. Okay, I just checked on something that I really should have done before I did all this testing. The M6 actually has a longer active duration than Timeline Stabilizer. That, coupled with its own bonus damage buff, means that probably would have been the better console to pick. That's a little embarrassing, but moving on. In the science consoles, first we've got the Tachyon Net drones. This is here mostly for that passive 10% crit severity buff, but its active ability is also pretty nice to have too. It fires off a Tachyon Net that looks like a big purple D20. Any enemies inside of it will receive a damage resistance debuff, and upon a critical hit, they will receive an extra bit of kinetic damage and their shields will go offline for a couple seconds. And remember the thing about Surgical Strikes, it pretty much always critical hits. And the last two consoles are the Tachyokinetic Converter and the Bioneural Infusion Circuits, both of which are from the Lobi Star. Both of these are here because of their crit severity buffs. The specializations, as usual, I am using the Intel specialization as my primary to gain access to space flanking, and the Temporal as my secondary to gain access to Entropic Rider. The traits, again, are my usual setup, so I'm going to go over them pretty quick. Adaptive Offense, which is a crit chance buff that turns into a crit severity buff and then back. In this case, we're really only wanting it for that second part. Context is for Kings for the bonus damage buff you get when you're not taking damage, though if you are taking damage, that turns into a damage resistance buff. Fleet Coordinator for the bonus damage buff based on your team size. Innocuous for the small crit severity buff and the reduced threat generation. Inspirational Leader for the stacking buff to most of my starship skills. Intel Agent Attaché to improve the cooldown of my captain's abilities. Superior Beam Training for the bonus damage buff to my beams. Symbiotic Ice, which applies a portion of my beam damage as cold damage. Terran Targeting Systems for the crit severity buff. Unconventional Systems to reduce the cooldown of my universal consoles every time I use a control ability. And the Boimler Effect, which is part of how I am reducing the cooldown of my bridge officer abilities. In the starship traits, first we've got Calm Before the Storm. This one takes a little bit to build up, but it does have an impressive firing cycle haste buff. Next is Emergency Weapon Cycle. Every time I use emergency power to weapons, this will also buff my firing cycle haste, and cut my weapons power cost in half. Overpowered and Overgun does pretty much the same thing, but it's activated when using certain firing modes. Specifically, whenever I activate Fire at Will, Beam Overload, Cannon Rapid Fire, Scatter Volley, or Surgical Strikes, which that last one is the one I'm using. I had a little trouble on deciding what to use for these next two traits, but ultimately I decided on Heart of Soul for the firing cycle haste buff as well as the small bonus damage buff, and Improved Critical Systems for its crit severity buff every time I use an emergency power bridge officer ability. And in the last starship trait slot is Vanguard Specialist, which this is the extension trait for all of the specialization firing modes. That includes Surgical Strikes. So with this I will be able to keep Surgical Strikes up nearly 100% of the time. In the space reputation traits, first we've got advanced targeting systems for the crit severity buff. Ooh, I probably should have swapped out these next two. Tyler's Duality and Precision both buff crit chance, which is kind of redundant on a Surgical Strikes build. Okay, instead of those two, I probably would have gone with Radiant Detonation Matrix. That'll give my weapons a chance to cause a little AoE radiation damage to a target, as well as remove a buff from one of them. And I guess Particle Generator Amplifier, because that'll give bonus exotic damage. So that'll be a bonus damage buff to anything that causes exotic damage, like the aforementioned Radiant Detonation Matrix, or something like Chemosite Lace Weaponry. Omega Kinetic Shearing would also work here because that would buff my Torpedo, and I do have one of those in this build. There's also the ability Counterstroke. That'll give you a lot of crit severity for a short duration, but it does require you to be under the influence of a control effect. Anyway, the other two traits that I am using are Magnified Firepower for the bonus damage buff to my weapons, and Controlled Countermeasures for the bonus damage against enemies that are under control effects. You know, like Tractor Beam or Gravity Well. Moving on to the Bridge Officer stations. First, in the Lieutenant Commander Universal slot, I am using this as an engineering seat, because I am using my engineering seat as pretty much nothing but intel. The engineering abilities I am using are Emergency Powered Up Weapons to buff my energy weapons and my weapons power, as well as to trigger some traits. Emit Unstable Warp Bubble, which is a control effect, so that will trigger unconventional systems. And it's the same story with Eject Warp Plasma. This is really just here just because it's a control effect that will trigger unconventional systems. In the tactical seat, first is Chemosite Lace Weaponry, which is giving my weapons a chance for some extra radiation damage, Attack Pattern Beta for its damage resistance debuff, and Torpedo Spread 3 to buff my torpedo. In the Commander Engineering / Intel seat, which I am using exclusively as an Intel seat, these first three are all here because they are also control effects that will trigger unconventional systems. So that's Viral Impulse Burst, Electromagnetic Pulse Probe, and Ionic Turbulence. And in the Commander spot, that is Surgical Strikes 3, that is the firing mode and what this whole build is built around. In the Lieutenant Commander Science / Miracle Worker seat, first we've got Jam Targeting Sensors, which is another unconventional systems trigger. Same with Tractor Beam in the next spot. And in the last spot, I did think about using Gravity Well here. Gravity Well is often nice for holding multiple enemies in one location, and plus that would be one more ability to trigger unconventional systems. But because this build is so focused on energy weapons, I decided to use Narrow Sensor Bands 3. With this, I can get a bonus damage buff to my energy weapons ranging between 20 and 50% depending on my range from my target. I did consider adding in Mixed Armament Synergy in here as well. The extra bonus damage to my weapons would be useful, but I didn't want to take away any more unconventional system triggers, because those are important for lowering the cooldowns of my Universal consoles. Okay, wrapping up the build with the duty officers. First we've got our two BOffs, 24 of 47 and 27 of 47. 24 is there for buffing my power levels, whereas 27 is there to buff my crit severity. These projectile officers are also here for buffing my crit severity. And then 42 of 47, which is the other half of my bridge officer cooldowns. Now let's head over to the combat log and find out how well this thing did in an elite run of the 9th Rule Patrol. Just shy of 250k. That's not bad for a 9th Rule run, especially considering this thing is using mostly beam arrays. Surgical Strikes was the leader on the DPS, as expected. Altogether, the Agony Beams under Surgical Strikes did 102k DPS. The Terran Task Force Phaser coming in with another 35k on its own. Then the Auxiliary Phaser Beam Array under Overloaded Will 3. That's from the Experimental Power Redirection. That's the Excelsior II's console. This did 21k, which honestly is not bad for a click ability. Now, one of the other abilities of this console is that it will trigger your normal weapons into using Fire at Will and Beam Overload. And that portion of the console actually didn't do so well. You can see the beam arrays under Fire at Will only did 2k, another 1k from the Terran Task Force Beam, only 100 DPS from Beam Overload 3. I've been saying how much I like this console, and I'm a little worried what's it doing to my weapons. Still a nice console, and honestly the fun factor on it is pretty high, at least for me. But yeah, that those numbers on those firing modes that it triggers, that's a little concerning for me. So yeah, that is my broadsiding Surgical Strikes build on the Excelsior II. Let me know what you guys think of it down below in the comments, and while you're down there, be sure to hit like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications for every time I upload a video. If you'd like to further support the channel, you can hit that join button to become a member, or hit the super thanks button, or find the link to the merch store in the video's description. Either way, thank you so much for watching. My name's Stu, and I will see you guys next time.